The soldiers of the 25th Infantry Division on Guadalcanal in the winter of 1942 gave their commander a nickname the way soldiers give nicknames, not as flattery, not as performance, but as the specific acknowledgement that something about the man was different from what they had expected and different in a way that mattered to them personally. Major General Joseph Lawton Collins drove his division through the jungle at a tempo that the terrain was not supposed to allow and that Japanese commanders had not planned for, maintaining pressure that prevented the enemy from reconstituting defenses that a slower advance would have permitted them to rebuild. His soldiers called him Lightning Joe because the lightning was real, because the speed was not a slogan but a method, not a personality trait but an operational philosophy that he had worked out completely and applied with the discipline of a man who has thought a problem through to its conclusion and trusts the conclusion. The nickname traveled with him from the Pacific to England to Normandy, where he commanded the VII Corps that landed at Utah Beach on June 6, 1944, and fought through 7 weeks of bocage stalemate until the moment in July when Collins proposed to Omar Bradley the operational concept that would become Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy that shattered the German front, opened the road to Paris, and made George Patton's spectacular drive across France possible. Patton got the headlines. Collins got the Distinguished Service Cross and the specific professional satisfaction of a man who knows what he actually did and does not require the public to know it as well. This is the story of what he actually did, told for the first time with the completeness it deserves. If you are new to this channel, subscribe now, because the general who opened the door that changed the war in Europe has been waiting 70 years for someone to tell his story right. The bocage had been defeating the Allied armies in Normandy since June 7th, the day after the landings, when the first American soldiers pushed off the beaches and into the dense hedgerow country that turned every field into a fortress and every lane into a kill zone. The hedgerows of Normandy were not the decorative borders of an English garden. They were earthen banks 4 to 6 feet high, topped with dense vegetation, rooted so deeply that Sherman tanks could not push through them and had to climb over them instead, exposing their thin belly armor to German anti-tank guns positioned on the far side. 7 weeks of fighting in this terrain had produced approximately 15 miles of Allied advance and casualties that neither the American public nor the Allied High Command had anticipated when the optimistic planning of the invasion had projected a rapid breakout from the beachhead. Collins had been fighting in the bocage with everyone else. His VII Corps had taken Cherbourg in late June, a significant achievement, but the drive south through the hedgerows had produced the same grinding attrition that was consuming every Allied formation on the Normandy front. He had been thinking about the breakout problem since the stalemate began, approaching it the way he approached every tactical and operational problem, as a system to be analyzed and solved rather than a situation to be endured. By early July he had a concept. On July 12 he presented it to Bradley. Sergeant John Huff drove him to Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters that morning, and Collins sat in the vehicle with his map and said almost nothing for the entire journey, looking at the map and looking at the ground and running the calculations that the briefing would require. Bradley's headquarters on July 12 was a building full of men who were under pressure, Eisenhower pressing for the breakout, Marshall pressing from Washington, the American public reading casualty reports that the optimistic tone of the pre-invasion planning had not prepared them for. Bradley received Collins in his map room, and the two men stood over the Normandy map with the focused attention of commanders who understand that what they decide in this room will determine what happens on the ground in ways that cannot be undone. Collins outlined his concept directly: the narrow frontage, the concentrated air bombardment, the immediate armor commitment before the Germans could reconstitute, and Bradley listened without interrupting, which was his characteristic mode of receiving operational proposals from subordinates he respected. When Collins finished, Bradley said he preferred a broader attack, spreading the assault across more frontage to prevent the Germans from concentrating their reserves. Collins was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Omar, a broad attack gives them time. A narrow attack at the right point does not give them time. Time is what they need to stop us. We deny them time by concentrating everything at one point and moving faster than they can respond." Bradley looked at the map. He looked at it for a long time. the specific focused attention of a commander checking an argument against the terrain it proposes to operate in. Then he said, "Show me the point." Collins pointed to the Purrier-Saint-Lô road. He explained the terrain south of it, the relatively open ground that would allow armor to move once the infantry punched through the defensive crust. Bradley looked at it. Then he said, "All right, Joe. Your concept. Your execution." Collins said, "Yes, sir. My concept. My execution." Sergeant Curtis Collin was not a general and was not at the planning meeting at Bradley's headquarters and had never heard of the operational concept that Collins had just sold to Bradley, but the contribution he had made to the bocage problem was as essential to Operation Cobra's success as any decision made at the Corps or Army level. Collin was a soldier in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron who had looked at the hedgerow problem and applied the specific practical ingenuity of a man who is not constrained by doctrine because he has not been trained to think in doctrinal terms. He designed a device from steel salvaged from German beach obstacles, a set of prongs welded to the front of a Sherman tank that allowed it to cut through hedgerows rather than climb over them, keeping the tank's belly armor down and its gun oriented forward rather than skyward. He built a prototype and demonstrated it to his commanders. His commanders demonstrated it to Bradley. Bradley watched a Sherman tank cut through a hedgerow in seconds rather than climb over it in minutes, exposing itself to German fire for the entire duration of the climb, and immediately approved mass production. By July 25th, approximately 500 Sherman tanks had been fitted with Collin's hedgerow cutters, the specific technical solution to the bocage problem that Collins' operational concept required. Collins knew about the hedgerow cutters and had incorporated them into his planning. He did not know Collin's name. He knew what the device did and built his assault around what it made possible. Collin received the Legion of Merit. The contribution his invention made to the success of Cobra has been consistently acknowledged by military historians as one of the essential enabling factors of the operation, a sergeant's practical ingenuity making a general's operational concept executable. The planning for Cobra required Collins to solve one problem that no operational concept could fully address. The air bombardment that was the operation's opening blow required accuracy that the technology of 1944 could not guarantee. The plan called for 1,500 heavy bombers, 400 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers to drop approximately 4,000 tons of bombs on a rectangle approximately 6,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep south of the Purrier-Saint-Lô road, saturating the German defensive positions before Collins' infantry advanced through them. The problem, the bomb line was the Purrier-Saint-Lô road, and American troops would be waiting to advance immediately north of that road. Any bombs that fell short would fall on American soldiers. Collins discussed this problem with Bradley and with Quesada, his tactical air commander, the man responsible for coordinating the air component of the operation, and the conclusion was unavoidable. The bombardment was essential. The risk of short bombs was real. The operation required accepting the risk because the alternative, a ground assault without the bombardment, would produce casualties that would dwarf any friendly fire losses. Collins made the calculation and accepted it. He told his division commanders what the plan required and what the risk was. Major General Leland Hobbs of the 30th Infantry Division, the formation that would be closest to the bomb line and therefore most exposed to short bombs, received Collins' briefing with the professional composure of a commander who understands that certain risks cannot be eliminated, only managed. He went back to his division and prepared his soldiers for an assault that might begin with American bombs falling among them. He did not tell them it would definitely happen. He prepared for the possibility that it would. Pete Quesada had been working with Collins since the early days in Normandy to build something that the American military had theorized about but never fully executed: genuine integrated air-ground combat, not air support requested through channels and delivered hours later but aircraft overhead responding to ground requests in minutes, directed by Air Force officers riding in the tanks they were supporting. Quesada was the finest tactical air commander in the American Army, and he had found in Collins the finest ground commander willing to give air power what it needed to function at its best, organic integration rather than separate arm support. They had argued through the arrangements in Normandy and reached agreements that other commanders had resisted. Quesada needed his liaison officers in ground unit headquarters. Collins gave him the space. Quesada needed Air Force officers in tanks during exploitation, men who could see what the tank crews saw and direct aircraft onto what the tank crews needed destroyed. Collins gave him the tanks. Their conversation before Cobra captured the philosophy they had built together. "Pete," Collins said, "I need your aircraft to be an extension of my artillery. Not a separate arm. An extension of my artillery. I need them where I need them when I need them." Quesada looked at him with the directness of a man who has been waiting for a ground commander to say exactly this. "Then I need my people in your vehicles," he said. Collins said, "Done." Captain John Downing was one of the Air Force officers who subsequently rode in a tank during the Cobra exploitation, looking through vision ports at the French countryside moving past, directing aircraft onto German columns that his tank's forward position allowed him to see before the armor reached them. In the first 72 hours of the exploitation, Downing directed 17 air strikes, each one removing from Rose's path an obstacle that might otherwise have slowed the advance that Collins had committed his armor to making. July 24, 1944, was the day Operation Cobra was supposed to begin and did not. Weather conditions were marginal, the air commanders were uncertain about bombing accuracy, and the mission was aborted. But not before some of the lead aircraft had already dropped their loads. The bombs fell short. They hit positions of the 30th Infantry Division, American soldiers waiting in their assault positions for an attack that had been canceled while the bombs that were supposed to support it fell among them. Collins received the casualty report that evening and went to Bradley's command post with the specific tension of a man who has absorbed difficult information and is processing it without allowing it to derail what needs to happen next. Bradley asked him whether he wanted to postpone. Collins looked at him. "If we postpone, we give them another day to repair what we've already damaged," he said. "We go tomorrow." Bradley nodded. "We go tomorrow," he said. Colonel Henry Matchett, Collins' operations officer, was at the command post when Collins returned from Bradley's headquarters. He watched Collins come in and go directly to the map and begin reviewing the next day's plan with the composed attention of a man who has made a decision and moved past it. He received the report of the casualties, Matchett said in a post-war account. He read the figures. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We continue." 2 words. No elaboration. No second-guessing. "We continue." That was Lightning Joe Collins. 2 words and back to the map. The morning of July 25, 1944, came to the Normandy front with clearing weather and the specific tension of a formation that has been told it is going today and believes it this time. Private First Class Francis Shade of the 30th Infantry Division was in his assault position north of the Purrier-Saint-Lô road when the sound began, the distant drone of aircraft that grew into the specific overwhelming sound of 1,500 heavy bombers approaching from the north. He had been briefed on the bombardment. He knew it was coming. The knowledge did not fully prepare him for the experience of it. The ground shaking, the sky dark with aircraft, the bombs falling in a pattern that moved south toward the German lines and away from him, and then, at some point in the second hour, began falling near him instead. The bombs sounded different from German bombs, Shade said in a post-war account. "I don't know how to explain that. They just sounded different. And when they started falling near us, I knew before anyone told me that something had gone wrong." 3 men in his squad were killed or wounded by short bombs before the bombardment ended. Shade was not wounded. He sat in his position with the dead and wounded of his squad around him and waited for the order to advance. General Leslie McNair, the architect of the American Army, the man who had built the training system that produced the soldiers who were about to advance, was observing the bombardment from a forward position when the short bombs fell. He was killed instantly. His 3 stars identified him. His death was kept secret for days. Collins received the report of McNair's death alongside the broader friendly fire casualty figures and made the decision that the operation required. He continued. Colonel Hammond Burks commanded the 120th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Division, the regiment most heavily affected by the friendly fire, and his management of his formation in the immediate aftermath of the bombardment is one of the most professionally demanding command performances of the entire European campaign. His regiment had suffered approximately 150 casualties from American bombs before the assault had even begun, men killed and wounded by the air force of the same army they were about to advance for. Burks went to his battalion commanders personally after the casualties were reported, not by message, not by radio, but in person, moving to the positions of the affected units and standing in front of the men who had been bombed by their own side and were now being asked to advance. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Franklin commanded one of those battalions. He described Burks arriving at his position with the specific authority of a commander who has decided that presence is the only adequate response to what has happened. Colonel Burks came to us, Franklin said in a post-war account. He did not pretend that what had not happened. He acknowledged it. He told us the men we had lost deserved to have their deaths mean something. He told us the only way their deaths could mean something was if we moved. He paused. We moved. Private Raymond Bauer was a runner in the same division, carrying messages between battalion headquarters and the forward companies through the bomb zone while the short bombs were still falling. He ran because standing still felt worse than running. He delivered 4 messages on July 25th, was wounded on the 4th run by a bomb fragment in his left arm, completed the delivery, and reported to the aid station. Like this video now, because what happens in the next 24 hours on the ground south of that bomb line is the moment that changes the entire war in Western Europe. The bomb zone that Collin's infantry advanced into on the afternoon of July 25th was a landscape that the bombardment had made into something that no map described and no briefing had fully prepared them for. Sergeant Warner Hamby of the 9th Infantry Division led his squad into ground where the hedgerows had been destroyed, the roads were gone, the farmhouses that had been landmarks were rubble, and the craters overlapped each other in a pattern that made movement a continuous negotiation with terrain that did not want to be crossed. The maps were useless, Hamby said in a post-war account. The roads were gone. The hedgerows were gone. The landmarks we had been briefed on were gone. We navigated by compass and by the sound of firing and by following the men in front of us. The German soldiers who had survived the bombardment in that zone were fighting from the craters themselves, men who had lost their prepared positions but had not lost the will to resist. Hamby's squad cleared 7 crater positions on July 25th, advancing approximately 1,500 yards through ground that had been the strongest section of the German defensive line the previous morning. Feldwebel Heinrich Becker had commanded a Panzer Lehr tank that survived the bombardment, the armor sufficient to protect his crew from bomb fragments though not from the concussion that had left 2 of his crewmen unable to hear and 1 vomiting when the bombing stopped. He had spent 90 minutes after the bombardment restoring his crew to fighting capacity with the patient determination of a non-commissioned officer who understands that a tank without a functioning crew is scrap metal. He engaged Collin's infantry when they appeared. He was pushed south. He attempted to establish a new position. Collin's armor, committed before that position was ready, broke through it before it could stop anything. The decision that transformed Operation Cobra from a tactical penetration into a strategic breakthrough was made by Collins on the morning of July 26th, and it was a decision that violated the conventional military logic that his own training had instilled in him, the doctrine that armor should be committed only after infantry had secured a clean breakthrough, a breach wide enough and deep enough that the armor could pass through without being engaged by German anti-tank weapons still active in the gap. The breach on the morning of July 26th was not clean. German positions were still active in the assault zone. His infantry had pushed through the defensive crust but had not eliminated everything behind it. Collins knew this. He committed his armor anyway, picking up his telephone and telling Maurice Rose of the 3rd Armored Division and the commanders of his other armored formations what the next 24 hours required of them. Sergeant John Huff had driven Collins to Rose's headquarters that morning for a face-to-face meeting before the armor was launched, Collins using the drive to look at the ground his armor would cross, arriving at Rose's command post and going in and coming out 20 minutes later with the decision made and the orders given. Huff asked him where they were going. Collins said back to the command post. Huff drove. Collins looked at his map and said nothing. The meeting with Rose had been the final confirmation. Collins looking Rose in the eye and saying what was required, Rose confirming he understood and would do it. Rose's 3rd Armored Division moved south through a breach that was not fully clean, going around German positions it could go around and through German positions it could not go around, keeping the momentum that Collins had told it to keep before the German command could understand what was happening well enough to respond to it. By nightfall on July 26, Rose's armor was 23 miles south of the line it had started from that morning. Fritz Bayerlein stood in the ruins of his Panzer Lehr division and attempted to describe to his corps commander what had happened to the finest armored formation in the German army in approximately 48 hours. The Panzer Lehr had been one of Germany's elite formations, built around experienced veterans, equipped with the best tanks Germany produced, positioned in the most critical sector of the Normandy front because its quality matched the importance of what it was defending. The bombardment of July 25 had done to it what bombardment at that scale and concentration does to any formation regardless of its quality. It had destroyed the physical infrastructure of the defense and done something to the survivors that went beyond physical damage. My front lines looked like the face of the moon, Bayerlein said in his post-war account, and at least 70% of my troops were out of action, dead, wounded, crazed, or numbed. He had walked through his positions after the bombing and found soldiers who were physically uninjured but psychologically destroyed, men sitting in craters staring at nothing, incapable of responding to orders, their nervous systems overwhelmed by sustained violence at a scale that no human body had been designed to absorb. He had attempted to establish a new defensive line south of the bomb zone on July 25. Collin's infantry had broken through it before it was organized. He had attempted a second line on July 26. Collin's armor had broken through that before it was built. By July 27, Bayerlein reported to Corps that the Panzer Lehr Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting formation, 80% casualties, equipment destroyed, organizational coherence gone. He was describing what Lightning Joe Collins had done in 72 hours to a division that had held the Allied armies for 7 weeks. General Lieutenant Dietrich von Koltitz commanded the 84 Corps, the German formation directly defending the Cobra assault sector, and his post-war account of the operation's opening days describes the specific experience of a corps commander watching his defense dissolve faster than his communications could track. The units that stopped reporting. The gaps that appeared in the line without warning, reported by flanking formations rather than by the units in the gaps because the units in the gaps were gone. The reserves that were committed and disappeared into the breach without stabilizing anything. Collins did not give us time, von Koltitz said in a post-war interview, his voice carrying the precise frustration of a professional who respects competence even when it has defeated him. Every other American attack had given us time. Time to identify the threat, time to move reserves, time to establish new positions. This attack did not give us time. By the time I understood what was happening, it was already too late to respond to it. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had replaced the wounded Rommel as Army Group B commander just 8 days before Cobra began and had arrived at his headquarters in time to watch the front he had inherited collapse, wrote to Hitler on July 28 with the controlled urgency of a man describing catastrophe in language that Hitler's court required to be softened but that the facts would not permit to be softened adequately. The left flank has collapsed, von Kluge wrote. I see no means of closing the gap. The enemy is through. He was describing Collin's breakthrough. He was describing the gap through which Patton's Third Army would drive in 4 days. He committed suicide 3 weeks later on a road in Germany, aware that arrest and execution awaited him in Berlin. Captain John Downing was in a tank in Maurice Rose's 3rd Armored Division on July 26, looking through the vision ports at a French countryside that was moving past him at a speed that armored operations in Normandy had not previously achieved, directing aircraft overhead onto targets that his forward position allowed him to see before the armor reached them. The arrangement that Collins and Quesada had built, Air Force officers in Army tanks, radios connecting the ground to the sky in real time, was producing at the operational level exactly what its architects had designed it to produce. Downing would see a German column on a road 2 miles ahead. He would call the aircraft overhead with the target's position. By the time Rose's tanks reached that road, the German column was gone. He directed 17 air strikes in the first 72 hours of the Cobra exploitation, 17 times that German resistance was removed from the path of the advance before the advance reached it, 17 times that the speed Collins had committed his armor to maintain was preserved by the air-ground partnership that he and Quesada had spent 2 months in Normandy building. Quesada said after the war that Collins understood air power better than any ground commander he worked with, that Collins treated the aircraft as organic to his corps rather than as a separate arm to be requested through channels. Collins said after the war that Quesada was the finest tactical air commander in the war, that Cobra worked because of the two of them and the fact that they had used the months in Normandy to figure out how to fight together. Neither man mentioned Patton when describing what made the breakout possible. Neither man needed to. Lieutenant Colonel Leander Donohue's 22nd Infantry Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division was advancing through the Cobra breach on July 27 when his lead elements emerged from the bocage into open country south of the German defensive zone, the terrain that Collins had identified in his planning meeting with Bradley as the operational objective of the breach phase, the ground that would allow armor to move the way Collins' concept required it to move. Donohue was at his forward command post when the report came from his lead company. The company had broken out of the hedgerows, the ground ahead was open, the German defensive crust was behind them. He picked up his radio and transmitted the message that Corporal Thomas Kilgore received at Collins' VII Corps Signal Center and carried immediately to the general's aide. The message: "We are through. I say again, we are through. The road is open." Kilgore handed the paper to the aide and watched Collins read it. He had expected something dramatic, the reaction of a commander receiving confirmation that the operation he had designed and argued for and launched at the cost of friendly fire casualties and the death of Leslie McNair had succeeded. What he saw was a nod. A single, composed nod. The reaction of a man whose plan had worked exactly as designed and who was already thinking about what the plan required next. "He did not react the way I expected," Kilgore said in a post-war account. "He didn't cheer or shout or do anything dramatic. He just nodded. Like he had expected it. Like this was what was supposed to happen and it had happened and now the next thing needed to happen." Collins put the message down and told his staff to get Rose on the telephone. The next thing needed to happen. Private First Class Francis Shade's platoon emerged from the bocage into the open ground on July 27 and stopped, every man in the platoon stopping simultaneously, not from an order but from the specific involuntary response of soldiers who have been in hedgerow country for 7 weeks and have suddenly encountered terrain that does not have a hedgerow on the far side. Staff Sergeant William Trent was the platoon sergeant. He described the moment with the NCO's perspective, understanding why his men had stopped, understanding they needed to keep moving, giving the order without explaining the first part because the first part was obvious to everyone and explanations were not what the moment required. "I saw my men stop when we came out of the bocage," Trent said in a post-war account. "I understood why they stopped. Then I told them to keep moving because open ground with Germans on it is not a safe place to stop and look." Shade described the moment from the private's perspective, the open ground in front of him after 7 weeks of hedgerows, the involuntary pause, the sergeant's voice telling them to keep moving, and then the moving. "We all stopped for a moment," Shade said. "Just stopped and looked at it. Then the sergeant told us to keep moving and we kept moving." What Shade did not know in that moment, what none of Collin's soldiers knew, was that the open ground they were looking at was the operational objective that Collins had pointed to on a map in Bradley's headquarters 2 weeks earlier. The planning and the execution had aligned at the specific point where a platoon of American infantry stepped out of the bocage and stopped and looked and then moved again because the sergeant told them to. Père Auguste Leblanc had been keeping his diary in the parish house at Marigny throughout the occupation and the fighting and the specific terror of being a civilian inside a military operation conducted at the scale of Cobra. His entry for July 25 described the bombardment from the ground, the sound that did not stop, the ground that moved, the prayer he offered for soldiers on both sides and for his parishioners in their cellars. His entry for July 26 described the American soldiers moving through Marigny without stopping, young faces, tired faces, faces that had seen what soldiers see, some of them crossing themselves when he blessed them from the church door, most of them keeping moving because the orders they were following did not include stopping. His entry for July 27 was 3 sentences. The Germans are gone. After 4 years, they are gone. I rang the church bell. Mayor Fernand Giat emerged from the building where he had sheltered through the fighting and watched Collins' armor move through his town on July 26, the tanks and half-tracks moving south at a speed he had not seen military formations move since the German army had driven north in 1940. They were going fast, Giat said in a post-war account. They looked like they knew where they were going. That was different from the Germans. The Germans always looked like they owned the ground they were on. These Americans looked like they were passing through on their way to somewhere else. Yvonne Delacroix was in the ruins of Saint-Lô when a young American soldier passed her on July 27. She asked him where they were going. He smiled. Paris, he said. He kept moving. She stood in the rubble of her town and watched his column disappear south and understood for the first time that the destruction of Saint-Lô had been the cost of something larger than Saint-Lô. The name Collins I learned much later, from a book, she said in a post-war interview. When I learned it, I felt that history had been unjust to him, and that history is often unjust to the men who do the actual work. Unteroffizier Wolfgang Klemperer had survived the Cobra bombardment in a bunker with 4 of the 9 men in his squad and had emerged into a landscape that his map described and that the bombardment had made unrecognizable. He moved south with his 4 survivors, navigating away from the American advance, looking for German forces to report to and German positions to defend. He encountered American infantry on July 26 before he found either. His 4 men were surrounded before he could organize a defense. He surrendered. In the prisoner collection point, he encountered German soldiers from multiple units, men who had survived the bombardment and fought and been unable to stop what Collins had set in motion. They compared their experiences and reached a consistent conclusion. We had been told the American army was not capable of this kind of operation, Klemperer said in a post-war interview. Whoever told us that had never seen Operation Cobra. Lieutenant Ernst Vogel of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich had been moving with a reserve formation toward a blocking position south of the bomb zone on July 26, a position that Collins' armor reached before Vogel's formation arrived. He engaged the American advance elements and lost his platoon and was wounded and was captured and spent his recovery assessing what had happened with the honest precision of a professional soldier whose training allows him to respect an opponent's accomplishment while deploring its consequences for his own side. They did not fight the way we expected Americans to fight, Vogel said in a post-war interview. They moved faster than we expected. They did not stop to consolidate. They kept going. By the time we understood what was happening, it was too late to respond to it. He was describing Lightning Joe Collins' operational philosophy in the words of a man who had been on the wrong end of it. George Patton's Third Army was activated on August 1, 1944. 6 days after Collins launched Cobra and 4 days after Donohue's message confirmed that Collins had broken through. The gap that Collins had torn in the German front was open, the road network south of Normandy was available, the German army that had held the Allied forces for 7 weeks had been shattered beyond coherent defense. Patton drove his Third Army through the Gap and across France with the spectacular aggression that made him the public face of the Allied breakout. The columns of armor moving fast through liberated French towns, the headlines that the speed of the advance generated, the press following Patton because Patton was the story they wanted to tell. Collins was not the story they wanted to tell. Collins had fought in the bocage and the bomb zone and the German defensive crust, terrain and conditions that were not visually or narratively compelling, that produced the kind of tactical fighting that is essential and unremarkable and forgotten. The breach phase of Cobra, Collins' actual achievement, required infantry advancing through bomb craters, armor committed before doctrine allowed, divisions fighting through a German line at enormous cost. The exploitation phase, Patton's contribution, required armor driving fast across open country, towns liberated, French civilians celebrating. The press followed the exploitation. The public remembered the exploitation. Bradley acknowledged the truth in his memoirs with the honesty that private assessment sometimes produces and public narrative rarely does. Lightning Joe deserved everything he got, Bradley wrote, and more. The "and more" was the acknowledgement that Collins had received less than his contribution warranted. It was an honest statement that changed nothing about what the public knew and believed. Helene Eugen had been in her cellar since the bombardment began on July 25 and emerged on July 26 to find American soldiers in her farmyard, young men moving fast, assessing her buildings with the quick professional attention of soldiers determining whether a position was a threat, moving on without stopping. One soldier paused at her door. He asked in broken French whether there were Germans in the farm buildings. She told him no. He nodded and said something she did not understand and moved on. She watched Collins' columns move past her farm through July 26 and July 27, the tanks and vehicles going south at a speed that told her something fundamental had changed even before she understood what had changed. They were going fast, she said in her account to French journalists in 1945. I had seen armies move through here before. These men were moving faster. I thought, whatever they have done, they have broken something open. She was correct. Collins had broken something open, the German front in Normandy that had held for 7 weeks, the stalemate that had consumed Allied soldiers and French civilians and Norman towns for 50 days of fighting that the optimistic pre-invasion planners had not scheduled. He had broken it with a concept that Bradley had initially resisted, with an armor commitment that doctrine had not sanctioned, with the specific operational intelligence of a man who had thought the problem through to its solution and trusted the solution when the moment required trusting it. The gap was open. The road was clear. The armor was moving. George Patton drove through the door that Lightning Joe Collins had opened, and drove through it brilliantly, and received the headlines that brilliance in the exploitation phase generates, and Collins received his Distinguished Service Cross and went back to his maps to plan the next operation. The story that the press told about the breakout from Normandy was Patton's story, the Third Army driving across France, the columns of armor moving through liberated towns, the general standing in his jeep with his pearl-handled pistols watching his formations move at a speed that no army had achieved since the German Blitzkrieg of 1940. It was a true story. It was not the complete story. The complete story required understanding what had made Patton's drive possible, who had torn the gap that the Third Army drove through, who had designed the concept and argued for it and executed it at the cost of McNair's death and 600 friendly fire casualties and the destruction of the Panzer Lehr Division and 2 days of the most intense combined arms fighting the American Army had yet produced in the European theater. Collins understood the dynamic without bitterness and without the specific resentment that men who have done the essential work and received insufficient credit sometimes carry through their lives. He said about it in a post-war interview with the dry precision of a man who has made his peace with a situation he cannot change and would not change even if he could because the situation was the product of doing his job correctly. George Patton drove through a door I opened, Collins said. He drove through it brilliantly. But I opened the door. The statement was not a complaint. It was an assessment. The engineer's precise description of what had happened, offered without elaboration because elaboration would have implied that the assessment required defense, and Collins did not believe it required defense. History would confirm it. He was content to wait for history. The autumn of 1944 brought Collins' VII Corps to the Hurtgen Forest, and to the battle that he himself would later assess as the one he fought least well. The Hurtgen was a dense German forest on the Belgian-German border, and it represented everything that Collins' operational philosophy was not designed for: terrain that negated air power, terrain that stopped armor, terrain that reduced every tactical action to the grinding infantry combat of World War I rather than the mobile combined arms warfare that had produced Cobra. He committed the 9th Infantry Division to the forest in October 1944, and the division suffered approximately 4,500 casualties in 3 weeks, comparable to its losses in the entire Normandy campaign. He committed the 4th Infantry Division, and it suffered similarly. The Hurtgen consumed American soldiers at a rate that the operational objectives it produced did not justify, and Collins received the casualty reports and continued the operation because the operational logic that had been presented to him, protecting the southern flank of the Allied advance, denying the Germans the forest as a staging area, required the forest to be cleared. Private First Class Paul Bosch fought in the Hurtgen under Collins' command and wrote a memoir that captured the specific horror of the place with the authority of a man who had been inside it. The Hurtgen was not like Cobra, Bosch wrote. Cobra was speed and light and the feeling that something had broken open and we were moving through the gap. The Hurtgen was darkness and mud and the feeling that the forest itself was fighting us. Collins visited the forward positions in the Hurtgen the way he had visited forward positions everywhere, going to the men rather than summoning the men to him, walking to the fighting in the mud and the rain. Bosch saw him there. "He came to us," Bosch said. "In the Hurtgen. He came." I don't know what he could have said that would have made the Hurtgen better. But he came. That mattered. Collins wrote about the Hurtgen in his memoirs with the specific honesty of a commander who has spent years examining his own record and has reached conclusions that self-protection might have prevented a lesser man from publishing. "The Hurtgen was the battle I fought least well," he wrote. "The forest negated our advantages. I should have found a way around it rather than through it. I did not find that way, and the men of the 9th Division paid for it." The statement stands in his memoirs without qualification or excuse, an acknowledgement of professional failure in a record that contained more professional success than almost any other American Corps commander of the war. It is characteristic of Collins that the same man who said, "My concept, my execution," about Cobra was willing to say, "I should have found a way around it," about the Hurtgen. He applied the same standard to his failures that he applied to his successes, the engineer's requirement that the assessment be accurate regardless of what the accuracy costs the assessor. Colonel Henry Matchett observed Collins during both operations and described the consistency of his commander's self-assessment across both experiences. "He was the same man at the Hurtgen that he was at Cobra," Matchett said. "The same process, the same standards, the same requirement for honest assessment. The difference was that at Cobra the honest assessment was that we had done it right, and at the Hurtgen the honest assessment was that we had not." He stated both conclusions with the same directness. That was Lightning Joe Collins. When the German Bulge offensive began on December 16, 1944, Collins' VII Corps was north of the attack, not in the line that the German assault had hit, not among the formations that were being overrun or surrounded or pushed back in the opening days of what Model and Rundstedt had designed as the decisive blow that would split the Allied armies and drive to Antwerp. Eisenhower and Bradley rapidly redeployed Collins southward with the specific confidence of commanders who know which of their subordinates to send when speed and aggression are what the crisis requires. Collins gathered his staff before the VII Corps counterattack in January 1945 and briefed them in the manner that Matchett had observed across the entire campaign, standing at his map, describing the situation, identifying what the situation required. He pointed to the German salient, the bulge that the offensive had driven into the American line, and described it not as a defensive problem but as an operational opportunity. "They went in," Collins said. "Now they have to come out. They come out through us or they don't come out. Our job is to make sure they don't come out in good order." He paused. "Move fast. Keep pressure. Don't give them time to reconstitute. Same as always." Matchett wrote in his account that those 3 words, "same as always," were the most complete description of Collins' operational philosophy he had ever heard. Same as always. Move fast, keep pressure, don't give them time. Cobra. The Bulge. The Rhine. Same as always. Eisenhower's assessment of Collins' bulge performance, filed to Marshall in February 1945, used language that by now had become consistent across every evaluation Eisenhower had written of his finest corps commander. Collins again demonstrated why he is the finest corps commander in the American Army. The Remagen Bridge was not in Collins' operational plan. On March 7, 1945, soldiers of the 9th Armored Division, part of his VII Corps, discovered the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact across the Rhine, the Germans having failed to destroy it before American forces reached it. The discovery was reported up the chain of command with the urgency that unexpected opportunities at the operational level require, and Collins received the report and responded with the instinct that had characterized every significant decision of his career: commit immediately, exploit before the enemy can respond, do not wait for the situation to clarify when the situation is already clear enough. His response to the report, recorded by his aide: "Get everything across that bridge right now. Everything. Don't wait for orders from above. Get across." He then notified Bradley, who confirmed the authorization. Bradley received Collins' report and understood immediately what it meant. The Rhine, which the German defense had been built to hold, had been crossed at a point and time of American choosing rather than German permission, because Collins had sent his armor forward fast enough to reach the bridge before the Germans destroyed it and had committed everything across it before the Germans could concentrate forces to contain the bridgehead. Sergeant Alexander Drobick was the first American soldier across. A butcher from Holland, Ohio, running across a bridge that was shaking from German attempts to destroy it, explosions around him, keeping moving because the sergeant had said go and he went. "I just ran," Drobick said in a post-war interview. "The bridge was shaking. There were explosions. I kept running." He reached the eastern bank and dove into cover. The first American soldier on the eastern bank of the Rhine was a butcher from Ohio who kept running because stopping did not seem useful. Collins received the confirmation that his forces had crossed the Rhine and were establishing a bridgehead on the eastern bank with the same composed response that Kilgore had observed when Donohue's breakthrough message arrived at Cobra. The nod of a man whose operational instinct had been confirmed rather than the reaction of a man who had been surprised by his own success. He wrote in his memoirs about Remagen, "That bridge changed the end of the war." The statement was characteristically economical. No elaboration, no self-congratulation, the precise assessment of a man who had looked at an opportunity and acted on it and was willing to state the consequence without overstating his own role in producing it. Bradley's assessment was more expansive. He described the Remagen crossing as one of the great operational opportunities seized in the entire European campaign, and he credited Collins' immediate decision to cross with making the exploitation possible. Eisenhower, when he received the report of the Remagen crossing, was at his headquarters in Reims. His reaction, recorded by his aide, was, "Joe Collins, of course." Not surprise. Not elation. The specific recognition of a commander who knows which of his subordinates finds opportunity in unexpected situations and acts on it before the opportunity closes. Joe Collins, of course. As if no other outcome had been possible once Collins was the man on the ground with the decision to make. The drive into Germany in the spring of 1945 produced the final accounting of what Operation Cobra had set in motion: the Falaise Pocket, the liberation of France, the crossing of the Seine, the drive to the German border, the Hurtgen, the Bulge, the Rhine, the advance to the Elbe. Collins' VII Corps was among the formations that reached the Elbe in April 1945, the river that would mark the boundary between the American and Soviet zones of occupation, the line where the war in Europe effectively ended for the American forces that had fought it from Normandy. His corps had advanced approximately 600 miles from the Perrier-St. Lo road where he had pointed on a map in Bradley's headquarters and said, "This is the point." The men who had made that advance, the soldiers of the 9th, 30th, and 4th Infantry Divisions who had breached the German line at Cobra, the tankers of the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions who had driven through the gap, the airmen of Quesada's 9 Tactical Air Command who had ridden in tanks and directed strikes from the air, were the men whose work had made everything that followed possible. Collins assembled his staff and his division commanders at the Elbe and looked at the river that marked the end of their advance and said very little. Matchett was there. He wrote that Collins stood at the Elbe for a moment and then said, "That's far enough." Then he turned and went back to his command post to deal with whatever needed to be dealt with next. Collins was appointed Army Chief of Staff in 1949 and served in that role through the Korean War, the most senior position in the American Army, reached by the man Bradley had called the finest corps commander in the European theater and Eisenhower had called the finest corps commander in the American Army. He occupied that office and managed the institutional army and advised on the Korean War with the same professional competence that had produced Cobra and the Remagen Crossing and the January 1945 counterattack, quietly, without the press attention that the role sometimes generates, without the specific celebrity that Patton's name continued to carry in the public imagination throughout Collins' service as the Army's most senior officer. He was Chief of Staff of the Army. George Patton was a legend. Both things were true simultaneously and neither canceled the other, and Collins, who had made his peace with the credit question in the same direct way he had made his peace with the Hurtgen, served his country in its most senior military office with the composed professionalism that had defined every day of his career since Guadalcanal. He published his memoirs in 1979, Lightning Joe, an autobiography, and the book provided what the public record had not, his own account of what he had done and how he had done it and what he thought about the gap between his contribution and his recognition. The account was honest, precise, and written without bitterness, which was entirely consistent with the man. Pete Quesada lived until 1993 and died at the age of 88 as one of the least celebrated of the genuinely great American commanders of the Second World War, the air commander whose partnership with Collins had produced the air-ground integration that made Cobra work, whose forward air controllers in tanks had directed the strikes that kept Rose's armor moving across France, whose insistence on placing Air Force officers in ground unit headquarters had been resisted by most Army commanders and embraced by Collins as the operational necessity it was. He said in his final years that the Cobra partnership was the finest military relationship of his career, that Collins had understood what air power could do when a ground commander trusted it and integrated it rather than requesting it through channels and waiting for it to arrive. "Joe Collins gave me what I needed to do the job," Quesada said. "He gave me his trust and his tanks and his radio nets. I gave him his air umbrella. Together we gave the Breakout its speed. Without the speed, Cobra is a successful tactical operation. With the speed, Cobra is the operation that changed the war." Maurice Rose did not live to give his post-war assessment. He was killed on March 30, 1945, his jeep intercepted by a German tank column in Germany, shot dead at the end of a war he had helped to win, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater after McNair. His 3rd Armored Division's drive in the first 72 hours of Cobra, 23 miles through a German front that had held for 7 weeks, remained the operational achievement that defined his legacy and confirmed Collins' armor commitment decision as the right decision made at the right moment. The story of Lightning Joe Collins and Operation Cobra asks questions that reach beyond the specific credit dispute into something more fundamental about how history remembers war and who it chooses to remember. Collins designed the concept. Collins argued for it against Bradley's initial preference. Collins committed his armor before doctrine sanctioned it and before the breach was clean, accepting the risk because the operational logic required accepting it. Collins coordinated the air-ground partnership with Quesada that kept Rose's armor moving at the speed the concept required. Collin's soldiers breached the German line at the cost of their lives and the lives of their friends, and in some cases at the cost of American bombs falling among them before the assault even began. Patton's soldiers drove through the gap those men had made and received the headlines that exploitation generates and that breach does not. Bradley acknowledged the gap between Collin's contribution and his credit in 4 words, and more. And the 4 words changed nothing about what the public knew. Eisenhower acknowledged it to Marshall in language that Marshall filed and that the public did not read for decades. The French civilians who watched Collin's columns move through their towns understood something had been broken open without knowing who had broken it, and learned Collin's name from books they read years later and felt that history had been unjust to him. History had been unjust to him. Not viciously, not deliberately, but with the specific structural injustice of a narrative that attaches to the dramatic and the visible and the quotable and passes over the methodical and the precise and the operationally essential. Lightning Joe Collins opened the door. George Patton drove through it brilliantly. The door needed to be opened before it could be driven through. Opening it was the harder job and the less celebrated one, and the man who did it deserved better than history gave him, and this is the record being set straight. Commanders and key figures involved in this historic event, for educational purposes. Major General Joseph Lawton, Lightning Joe Collins, Commanding General, VII Corps. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, Commanding General, 12th Army Group. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, SHAEF. Major General Maurice Rose, Commanding General, 3rd Armored Division. Major General Leland Hobbs, Commanding General, 30th Infantry Division. Major General Manton Eddy, Commanding General, 9th Infantry Division. Major General Raymond Barton, Commanding General, 4th Infantry Division. Major General Elwood Pete Quesada, Commanding General, 9 Tactical Air Command. General Leslie McNair, Commanding General, Army Ground Forces. General der Panzertruppen Fritz Bayerlein, Commander, Panzer-Lehr Division. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, Commander, Army Group B. Generalleutnant Dietrich von Koltitz, Commander, 84 Corps. Colonel Hammond Burks, Commander, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Division. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Frankland, Commander, 1st Battalion, 120th Infantry. Lieutenant Colonel John Dowdy, Commander, 8th Infantry Regiment, 4th Division. Lieutenant Colonel Leander Donahue, Commander, 22nd Infantry Regiment, 4th Division. Sergeant Curtis Cullen, 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Captain John Downing, Forward Air Controller, 3rd Armored Division. Colonel Henry Matchett, VII Corps Operations Officer. Sergeant John Huff, Collins driver. Corporal Thomas Kilgore, VII Corps Signal Company. Time, July 1942 to August 1944. Dates, Collins takes command 25th Infantry Division, May 1942 Guadalcanal cleared, February 1943 Operation Cobra planning begins, July 1944 July 24 abort and preliminary friendly fire, July 24, 1944, Operation Cobra launches. July 25, 1944, armor committed. July 26, 1944, breakthrough confirmed. July 27, 1944, Patton's Third Army activated. August 1, 1944. Locations: Guadalcanal, Pacific Theater, Normandy, France, Saint-Lô, France, Purrier Saint-Lô Road, France, Marigny, France, SAF headquarters. Weather: Normandy summer, overcast conditions that delayed Cobra's launch, clearing on July 25, Pacific jungle heat and rain on Guadalcanal. Units involved: U.S. VII Corps, U.S. 9th Infantry Division, U.S. 30th Infantry Division, U.S. 4th Infantry Division, U.S. 1st Infantry Division, U.S. 2nd Armored Division, U.S. 3rd Armored Division, 9 Tactical Air Command, German Panzer-Lehr Division, German 275th Infantry Division, German 84 Corps.